Oh, look at that. It's an we're actually competing with the inauguration of President Joe Biden, which is great for our ratings. This is Bring It In Troops, little Zoom from quarantine show. We have a lot to talk about today. Happy to be joined by David Thorpe, of course, and eminent historian from Emory University, Carl Suddler. How are you, Carl?
I'm good. I'm good. Happy to be here with you guys. Happy New Year and all that good stuff.
Very glad to have a historian here on a history making day.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
um, so before we get into what we had originally planned, last night there was some video of Adam Silver speaking at a Zoom conference talking about the idea that NBA players might jump in line for the COVID vaccine, and I think Judy's going to play that now.
We're something like 2.5 times more likely to have failed. Black, in terms of deaths, proportionately, if you're Black with COVID, something like 3 times more likely to die with that disease, and you're, I think, close to 4 times as likely to be hospitalized. But now, somewhat perversely, there's been enormous resistance in the African American community for understandable historical reasons, resistance to getting vaccinated. And they're seeing that already, even among the older age cohorts, and even talking to people who ran the trials for Pfizer and Moderna. There was resistance even there to getting African Americans to volunteer. And that's been, and even as against other ethnic and racial groups, African Americans stand out in terms of resistance to vaccinations. Again, for understandable reasons historically. But having said that, if that resistance continues, based on the earlier data I cited, there'll be very much a double whammy to the Black community, because the only way ultimately out of this pandemic is to get vaccinated. Where our players have great influence, it's also among young people who also seem to be hesitating, just based on, because they haven't been eligible yet.
Thank you, Judy. Look, and there's Ben Cohen of the Wall Street Journal. Hi, Ben. How are you? Good morning.
Hi.
Um,
Hi.
So there's a lot. I think you know what Adam said. I'll just add Michelle Roberts, the head of the NBPA, recently was quoted by Yahoo saying, I've got some very close friends and really smart people have said to me, Michelle, it's a no-brainer. Of course, you'll take the vaccine. Unlike my players, I'm considerably older than they are and probably further up on the list. But I haven't made up my mind. I'm eager to be convinced that these are safe. I'm hopeful I'll be convinced that they're safe, but I'm not a cheerleader. I'm not at a place yet where I would wholeheartedly and fulsomely say, absolutely, you have to take it. Seems like a little bit of a simmering thing here. Ben, you wrote something about this months ago. Can you tell us what you found?
Yeah, with my colleague Louise Radnowski, I think in the first week of December, we basically asked a bunch of people in the public health community, not fringe figures, but like really big folks, whether this was a crazy idea for the league to consider or for like even the government to consider. And in fact, they said it's not crazy. It's actually quite sensible. One of the people who was the loudest cheerleader for it was a guy named Harvey Feinberg, who is this towering figure in the history of American public health. He was the former dean of Harvard's medical school. He was the former president of the National Institute of Medicine. He ran what could have been the vaccination rollout campaign for the swine flu outbreak that nearly became an epidemic and pandemic in 1976. And what he said is that he could absolutely see NBA players playing a role in this. He even came up with a tagline like, "When it's your turn, take a shot," which I think maybe there might be some you might need some marketing folks to tweak that a bit. But he said, in fact, he literally said, "I'm not joking. This is a very serious proposition. Like, I think this is like absolutely something that the league should consider." And the more folks that we asked, the more people who sort of endorsed that concept. I think, however, like that is quite a ways off. I mean, what we have seen so far in the rollout campaign is that the biggest problem right now does not seem to be vaccine hesitancy. It's that demand is far outstripping supply. And I think probably maybe you discussed this before I popped on, but it was sort of a notable about face for the league, because it wasn't too long ago when Adam Silver said that in no way, shape, or form would the league be jumping the line on a vaccine. Now, I think you could argue that this is not jumping the line, especially if the government is asking them to help. But one of the really interesting things and sort of funny twists that we found while reporting this story is that some people said, yeah, it's a great idea in theory, but like before we actually roll this out, we have to see if NBA players test well. Like if players actually, if people actually trust them, if they are telling you to get the shot, is that going to open? Is that going to alleviate or cure any vaccine hesitancy? I don't know. I mean, it would be fantastic fortune for the league if that were the case. And I think you can make an argument that like 500 vaccines out of, a million a day is not actually all that big of a deal. But there are lots of thorny ethical, moral questions that have to be worked out here.
Yeah, for sure. Carl, do you want to? We invited Carl on the show to talk about a different issue, and now we're just but in the warm up, I think I've got clearance. Carl, you're willing to weigh in on this? Do you want to do that now?
Yeah, no, sure, certainly. Yeah, I mean, I'm still a historian, and I'm an African American historian, right? And so, when somebody like Adam Silver jumps out and says, and naturally because of the history of African American distress in the community, it's just like, well, what does that mean, right? And obviously there's a long history there, and depending on where you want to start it, in slavery, after slavery, with Tuskegee, after Tuskegee, the conversation there needs to be had. I think, the NBA case is something that also, speaks to another thorn in the issue beyond just race. Is also just, it's going to open the floodgates for money and access to vaccine, right? It's going to open a class-based conversation when we know that people living in impoverished conditions have been impacted by this much more heavily, right? And so what happens when you give millionaires access first, right? And what does that change, and what does that do to the conversation, right? And so we're having this kind of dual-headed conversation that certainly you can make the case that if you get a large sampling of Black people to publicly come out and say, well, we just took the vaccine, it may be able to impact how Black folks or the Black community might be responding to it. But what does it say that we got a large group of Black millionaires, quote unquote, because not all NBA players are millionaires, right? But that they are the sampling, right? Because, I think one of the first stories that came out was also in California, right? That there were a bunch of, celebrities trying to jump the line, and there were people willing to pay X amount of hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the shot. And, and I think you have to tread softly here, right? Because on the one hand, you do consider, Black mistrust and, public health and for right reasons. But you also have, the undercurrent to this conversation, and it's also about giving people with privilege, people with platforms, people with money, priority over the people who've been impacted the most by this.
Guys, why can't we? I mean, Ben made a point and mentioned the whole marketing thing, and then Dr. Suddler, what you said. Why can't we combine the two in a sense? So NBA teams are going to get it in inner cities, and maybe it's their inner city. It makes some sense. Where you come out, and they can do autographs beforehand. After they do it, my parents both had it, and my mother-in-law, and all their arms were sore. And so to make them sign autographs doesn't make sense, but you can do some kind of marketing to get into the communities and get a big turnout. Although I think Henry's point initially is, well, I know Ben said it, availability is an issue. So I wasn't so aware of that, because my concern is in Florida, I think a lot of senior citizens aren't going back to get their second vaccine. Like a huge percentage of them are going back for reasons I have no idea why. And so if there's doses to be had, we need to put them in people's arms. Someone's got to be smart enough to be able to combine the two ideas together and get a lot of people vaccinated.
But so it's my team. I can't talk anymore. It turns out. So I was talking about this with Louisa Thomas, who we've been texting this morning, and she was making a lot of amazing points. And my thought was mainly like, I don't know if we have a broad vaccination problem or not. We're so early, right? Like, because peer pressure hasn't happened yet, right? So do you remember when LeBron said that he wouldn't play in December? And
yeah,
and he meant it, right? But then everybody else said they would play in December. And of course, LeBron's playing in December, right? Like, and I feel like we'll see if we need a campaign to get people to accept the COVID vaccine. Like once we get through what we're going to guess, 70% of America is just going to be like, give it to me, right? And then 30% will be left. And then we'll see if we need a campaign, right? Like maybe maybe at that point, those 30% are much more convincible than they would be when it's so theoretical now, right? Like right now, it's like, here's this thing that no one has gotten that does have some side effects, right? I don't know. It feels a little bit early to worry about making sure more people accept it when we can't even get it to 10% of America.
Yeah, by the way, the LeBron thing reminds me that he also said he wouldn't play in empty arenas and he wouldn't play in the bubble,
Right.
and he kind of won a championship in both. One of the vaccine scientists that we talked to, this guy named Peter Hotez, down in Texas, said that he thinks that NBA players and celebrities and public figures could be especially helpful to get people to take the second dose of the vaccine, because as we know, Pfizer and Moderna are currently 2-dose vaccines, and from what we know about side effects, like the more adverse reactions tend to be in the 24 hours after the second dose, and like inevitably there are going to be stories of people like having the adverse reactions that are described by the companies and the scientists, and people might be hesitant, in addition to just like getting them back to the vaccine sites like David talked about. That is something where like maybe athletes could come into play. If we're this also, I mean, I think we're all sort of dancing around this. I mean, I think the league wants players to be vaccinated because they want players to be vaccinated, and if they think that there is some public health value that they can enhance that strategy with, they're going to embrace it. But like really what they want is for like the league to continue playing basketball without having postponements pop up hours before the game. And like it's a question of if and also if like now we're just thinking aloud here, but like, does every player have to be vaccinated, or like does LeBron James, Steph Curry, and Damian Lillard suffice? And like I don't know. I mean, it's I think this is like sort of what's fun to think about with this, is that it's an interesting question of public health, and there are lots of implications, and I don't think there are any clear answers right now.
Yeah, I gotta be honest, just for me, like as a baseline, like you can't forcibly inject anyone with anything, right? Like, come on. I just feel like, and I know it's hard. Like we're gonna have holdouts, right? We're gonna have COVID will last longer in America because of this, right? But like to me, like of course they're gonna be some 10% of people just aren't gonna get it, right?
And also there might be a way to thread the needle. We've seen like we saw the PSA with Kareem, right? Kareem is like a guy who kind of has that trust factor that probably even more so. Coaches are going to be part of groups like the top group. Like Greg Popovich could probably, I don't know what Texas is doing right now, but you would imagine that if he wanted to get the vaccine, he would be pretty close to getting it if they're at 65 or 75 or above. And there are lots of people like that. So it's not just the players. I mean, in fact, the people who are most at risk and most vulnerable are coaches who could probably get the vaccine on their own pretty soon.
Yeah, and I do think that's the elephant in the room, and I'm glad you brought that up, Ben, is because it's just the timing of it, right? It's just the NBA bubble worked, quote unquote, so well without any postponements, played X amount of games, and even though it was a miserable experience, it seems like for all those involved, right? But the timing of it is that on the back end of postponements for the first time, of trying to think of the longevity of the season, all of a sudden this sort of like, well, maybe we should get the players vaccinated, right? It's also, needs to be considered, is this a fix for the season, right? A season that inevitably is going to continue to have very, who knows how many postponements. And we all know postponements impact pockets, right? And those pockets are making or driving many of these decisions.
That's that, and coupled with what Ben quoted them saying before, right? Like in no way, shape, or form they wouldn't be cutting in line, basically. Like that they are now. It's like, well, now they're feeling the heat, right? It seems so. It definitely serves the billionaires for LeBron to get vaccinated, right? Like, does it serve LeBron? Like, I don't. That to me is actually this is a real question. Has anybody here? I don't think I've seen a single report of like players expressing their feelings about the vaccine. Does anybody know if like people are excited to get it?
And I've talked to players. I have one who definitely won't take it. And if they try to force him to take it, I'm not sure he would. And his wife has also said to me, like, what are we going to do? Because I don't think he's going to take it no matter what. And I had no answer to that. Everyone else said I probably talked to 20 people in the league who said they would take it, but I definitely know for sure one won't.
Yeah.
Well, and that brings up interesting questions about collective bargaining and the union and the league and whether employees can be compelled to take the vaccine to return to work. And that's something that like companies around the globe are going to have to figure out over the next year. Like, you know, are you allowed back in the office? Are you allowed to be around your colleagues and employees if you refuse to take the vaccine? I mean, colleges, I believe, require students to be vaccinated, right? You know, not for flu, but for MMR and for other common diseases. So I think, I mean, there is, I mean, you can't get 450 NBA players to do anything, right? So like, they're not all going to do this. The question is like, how fierce is that like anti-group? And like, you know, as we all know, like peer pressure is a really powerful force, especially in the NBA. If LeBron tells the rest of his teammates, get the vaccine, we're not getting shut down anytime soon. Like we have a championship in sight, right? Like, are they going to, they might listen to LeBron, right? They might not need like a PSA of LeBron when they have LeBron in person telling them to get vaccinated right away. I don't know how LeBron happens to feel about this, but like just using him as a stand-in for like a leader on a team trying to get people around him to take the shot. I mean, I think this is, you know, regardless of whether they get early access, like probably NBA players will be in the constituency that like has access to the vaccine by the playoffs, right? Like if we're thinking like May, June, like at the very least, at the very latest July. And so this is going to be an issue, if not this season, then definitely by next season. And like there will have to be a solution to it at some point.
Ben, have you done any reporting at all or read any reporting regarding how many more doses might be starting to be made available now that there's a change in government administration?
Well, I think they're going to try to. There's a question of what the reserve that has been set aside for second dose. I mean, I think probably the biggest thing that could happen is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is a one-shot vaccine, is nearing phase 3 results, and if that hits the market, then suddenly like you could really accelerate the rollout campaign. So I think they're probably fairly. I don't know this for sure, but just from what I've read as like an interested observer, it seems like there are some pretty simple fixes that like the Biden team can do to accelerate vaccine, and I think that was going to happen anyway. Like the part of the slowness of the rollout was that it happened around the holidays. I mean, that's not like, it's not a good excuse, but it's like sort of the explanation, I think. And so I mean, we're currently, I think, around 1 million people a day getting vaccinated. It's
really?
What
that's amazing.
I believe
like,
so. Yeah, I mean, somewhere like between 800,000 and 1 million based on the day. I think smart people say we need to get to like 2.5 to 3 million a day to like return to normalcy anytime soon. Hopefully that happens, and hopefully that means that all of us can get vaccinated soon too.
Is there, okay, so this brings up so many issues, but listening to Michelle Roberts, or and on the True Post we published this morning, quoted Michelle Norris in the Washington Post, who rolls through like Henrietta Lacks, the Holmesburg prison experiment, where retin-A, I don't know if anyone here has used retin-A before, but they tested it in painful procedures without disclosing the dangers. J. Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, was lauded until 2018 with a statue in Central Park. He performed reproductive experiments on enslaved Black women without anesthesia. Are you kidding me? Or of course, the Tuskegee syphilis study and others. It makes me think, like, I'm the son of a doctor. We talked about medical research a lot growing up. Like, I don't 100% trust when I see like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials declare this safe, because I know that sometimes, nevertheless, they roll these things back. But it is a kind of a white privilege, right? That I generally feel like, oh, the FDA did its thing, we're probably good now. Anyone? Bueller?
Yeah, no, and again, so it's a historian in the room, right, who reads a lot of books, right? Like, you know, there are, you know, for those interested, right, there are really good histories about this stuff, right? And you know, again, like that FDA stamp means something different in different communities, right? Like, you know, the approval, right? You know, I work at a university with the CDC on campus, you know, and you know, with that being said, I live in a neighborhood or near neighborhoods where most people don't even trust the CDC, right? And so even the proximity to these institutions actually isn't going to change feelings because of this long, perverse history, right, of experimentation with Black people. And, you know, and so the reservation and, you know, the pause, you know, has to be has to be expected, right? Like, you know, if at this point in 2021 you don't expect it, like, then you've just not been paying attention, right? Now it's a question on, you know, how do you get around it, right? Or how do you kind of convince otherwise? And you know, and I'm not sure anything from the history will actually give us an answer, right? Because you know, we know that with this, you know, with the COVID vaccine, we saw so much of what was like, you know, doctors of color coming forward early and frontline workers coming forward, frontline workers of color coming out early. And that was very deliberate. But that ended up kind of like, you know, flipping on its head and people being like, well, why are you giving all the black doctors the COVID vaccine on TV? Where are the white doctors, right? And we saw that kind of tension arise, right? It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing. And I just don't know if there is, you know, a right answer. Judy asked if, you know, if I plan on getting it. Yeah.
She
you
got you
know,
married already too, Carl.
that's right. I know. She jumped there. So, you know, coach says I need a date, you know, before the engagement's okay. And then Judy is just like, you know, forget
You're
the
done.
date, you know, you're done. You went to the court. But no, I think you know, like, you know, again, and my fiance has a PhD in gender studies, but all of her research is in public health work. And you know, most of what we talk about is a lot of that distrust, where it kind of stems from, and not only Black communities, but also, you know, Latinx communities, because of so much of what happens in Latinx communities around translation, right? Like she wrote an entire dissertation about how these organizations fail to properly translate documentation into Spanish-speaking communities, right? That led to kind of, you know, crazy numbers of HPV, HIV, and AIDS in, you know, Latinx communities. And so much of, you know, but so how do we get to the point, knowing the history of it is I think, you know, I think the back end is, you know, we both are children of military families, you know, and my dad's like, they shoot you up with so much stuff before you go into military. I don't know what vaccines are in me, right? And you know, and I look at it like, well, I guess he's all right, you know, and so I, you know, so I do think there has to be some sort of personal kind of connection, personal responsibility, and I also think, you know, what'll be interesting is to see those who have been impacted the most, right? You know, so if we're thinking about the NBA, right, like somebody who's become to the front of it is like Karl Anthony Towns, right? What is Karl Anthony Towns' stance on getting vaccinated, right? That would be, you know, a huge kind of like story, a huge kind of like experience, because we've seen so much trauma in his life caused by this disease, right, and this virus.
That's right. If it were a Karl Anthony Towns led effort, totally different, right? Like
Actually,
we hear about it. It's sponsored by DraftKings on an NBA valuations Scott Soshnick business interview. I'm like, ooh, this was a terrible place for this idea to leap forward, right? Like,
well,
after
and Town, and if you do it through Towns, you just do it through the Mayo Clinic, which is right next door to the Timberwolves, right? I mean, I think the way that the NBA could play a role here, and again, like this is something I think it would actually be impossible for the NBA to do this on their own. Like they need to be tapped by public health authorities and the government to do this. But like really the question here is, who do people trust? And do people trust NBA players to tell them what to do? It might be that in some communities you'd rather like, you know, have a pastor or a church official like get vaccinated like in front of his congregation. Politicians are huge. Like it's not a coincidence that Joe Biden and Tony Fauci and I guess Mike Pence like also like all got vaccinated on live television. And it's probably harmful to public health, regardless of what you think about him, that Donald Trump has not been vaccinated as far as we know, and certainly like not publicly for, you know, 75 million people who voted for him. Like that might that, you know, that would be a reassuring thing. That one of the studies that we found while writing this story was that Barack Obama in 2009 during the swine flu outbreak, which I guess the swine flu pandemic, simply by saying that Sasha and Malia were vaccinated for H1N1 had a huge effect on people's willingness to have their own children vaccinated. Gerald Ford and his whole family got vaccinated on live TV in 1976. And, you know, on the contrary, Tony Blair's refusal to say whether his son was vaccinated for, I think, MMR when he was in 10 Downing Street also had a huge effect the other way. So like people with bully pulpits can have a huge influence. And when we're talking about like potentially needing somewhere between like 70 and 90% of the population to get vaccinated to reach herd immunity, like any little bit that you can do, I think is really important.
Or maybe it means everything should happen with Tony Blair's son on screen. Maybe that's the answer. It's just all Tony Blair's son. Yeah, I have to admit, the other thing that worries me a little bit is like I know Joe Biden got the Pfizer vaccine, and whenever our numbers come up, right, we might get there and they're like, oh, for you, we have the Johnson and Johnson or whatever, whichever one. Like there is a little bit of a potential for a class structure in the vaccines and their distribution, and like that's not going to help. Like I could see Carl's dad being like, well, everyone in the army is getting the same thing, right? There's maybe something a little safe in that, right? But there are different ones. That feels like it could be, oh, everybody kind of knows the Pfizer Moderna ones went first, right? Like that's kind of the creme de la creme, it feels like.
Can we at least address just officially on the record that the idea of you being concerned about it as a tracking device when you carry your phone everywhere? Can we just stop with that? Like if you're not carrying a phone because of that, then you can say whatever you want to say. But if you are, you probably shouldn't be worried about the vaccine tracking you. And then just the other thing is, I'd love for Ben to look into the efficacy of, to take your point on Karl Anthony Towns, who I think has COVID right now. If there was a movement by the NBA, instead of vaccinating their players, of having them escort their parents to get one. I know the player I talked to that said he's not going to do it. Actually, he's white. And I said, dude, you think I love my parents? He's like, Coach, I know you do. I said, they're both getting it. So is my mother-in-law, and I adore them all. Like, I have a family in the business that they're doctors, and they got it, and they got their parents to get it. My brother's wife's mom. That helps because we all know we're not going to do anything to ever hurt our parents, right?
Did that move that player's opinion at all?
It did. He took me more seriously because he knew I wasn't getting it, because I said I'll be the last to get it because I have plenty of land around me. I can easily stay away from people. I said my parents got it, and it definitely it made him think. We'll see what happens when he finally gets a chance to get it, which won't be for a while. He's in his 20s unless the NBA does something about it. But yeah, I think
why is he hesitant right now? What is his concern?
It's not based on science. He's one of these people. He's crazy brilliant, very, very brilliant dude. And he's reading all these other anti-vaxxer sides and anti-big farm. And I get a lot of his points. And you can't be friends with people like Carl and not read the kind of stuff we're reading and recognize that it isn't just Black people. Obviously, they have enormous amounts of complaints. There's a lot of fucked up shit that's happened regarding these kinds of things. And he's one of these people that tends to buy into it more.
Yeah, trust the machine has taken a little bit of a beating.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you think would move that player?
Probably getting his wife to really push it. He's happened to be married to a brilliant woman, and he loves her and adores her, and she picks her battles. And this is one thing that I think she'd pick. Like at some point, I think so to make it a broader point though, Ben, we all have to find, this is what we do as coaches too. How do you reach each player? There's no one key that works for all of them.
It might be Tony Blair's son. I don't know.
Right. You got to find that pressure point and build trust. And there's a reason why it's very hard to get basketball players to trust us. They shouldn't trust us. They have been hustled by coaches their whole life. They've been hustled by everyone in this business from the moment they started making shots, more so than most of their competitors and teammates. And so to me, I take that as a challenge. Like I have to earn their trust. And I flat out tell them, don't just trust me because I'm older than you and have a reputation. I have to work for you. But that also puts me on the clock. Like I have to do work to earn their trust on the court and as a man, right? As a father figure in a sense to a lot of them. Everyone's different that way. That's why I was just thinking, when you see LeBron James getting it's one thing. When he makes sure his mom gets it, I just think that's going to impact a lot of these players and people in the community in a way that maybe just seeing LeBron getting it wouldn't be the same. By the way, he's Superman. So yeah, of course, LeBron will get it. He's Superman. Nothing's going to beat him. But when he takes his mom in, I think it'll have an impact.
Yeah, that's really interesting because we're talking on the one hand about how to potentially convince NBA players to take the vaccine, and we're also talking about how can you get NBA players to convince other people to take the vaccine. Right? There are two separate lines of thought there, and they kind of align. But but there are different. Maybe you just have LeBron take Alex Caruso with him and say like Superman and like the other guy, and like they'll both be fine, and the Lakers will win a championship.
Superman and Robin's little brother.
Right.
It would be amazing to have a PSA of LeBron taking his mom, and then some touching byplay as LeBron's mom gets the vaccine. I'm sure that'd be tremendously effective. Doesn't do anything for Adam Silver though. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like if Adam Silver's goals are actually to engender trust in the vaccine, that would work for him. But he really needs LeBron to get that shot too. If it's about his bosses.
Can I ask a question for you guys? Do you think the public outcry would be as fierce if NBA players get vaccinated, say next month, as it was when players were tested in March, when testing supplies were really scarce? Like we would think they would take some sort of PR hit, but like, would it be a speed bump? Like, is it something that would like cripple the league? Like, what would public reaction actually be?
I mean, it depends on the supply. If we're reading about stories about struggling to get enough doses in, it's an enormous problem. If we're not, then I think it washes away pretty quickly, like it did this summer.
And to that point, I also think it depends on location, right? Like Georgia is infamous for all types of things go wrong, right? I mean, and so if the Atlanta Hawks jumped the gun when so many people in Georgia, even in this moment, who are 65 plus with conditions, have not been able to get vaccinated, right? It's gonna look bad, right? And so I think like location, because this is a state to state thing, can also have an impact, right? And I for one would actually think like I'd be interested to know where somebody like Lloyd Pierce or Coach Pierce and the Hawks, and thinking about all of the efforts that they put forward, about being, spreading democracy in different ways, would actually stand on having his team jump the gun, right? Like, there might be some reservation, from a team like the Hawks to jump the gun because of how things are going in Georgia, right? It's the fourth highest rated state in terms of COVID numbers. It's, one of the poorest states in terms of vaccinations. What if Coach Pierce is just like, my guys aren't getting it? Right. We will open up State Farm to become a vaccine clinic, right? Like in the way that they opened it up for the votes that,
right,
ended up playing pivotal in November. Right. And so it'll be, so I also think something that we need to consider is location, right? Everywhere is not going to be the same, and then because this is a state by state thing, I think, there's a lot there.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, because this is the one thing we've like really learned over the last month, is that this is not a federal rollout campaign. What the federal government has essentially done is punted to states, and like every night I look at like the Bloomberg vaccine tracker to see like state by state how states are performing, and like it depends on like your state government, and states are allocating the shots differently right now. Like in some states, if you're 65, you can get it. In New Jersey, if you're a smoker, you can get it. Like so like what the Knicks do is not going to be what the Sixers do, is not going to be what the Hawks do. And I think that's like the NBA is a national league, but like they have this is a state by state thing, and like that can't really apply here.
NBA players start smoking to get the vaccine. It makes so much sense. Yeah. Well, so Ben, I just want to check in. I promised you I would give you a graceful out at 15 minutes past the hour. Missed that terribly.
No, I'm gonna hop. This was so interesting and actually really helpful to me. I'm sure you have a much more interesting conversation to have with Carl that I will listen to later.
No, thank you so much for joining us, and great stuff. We'll
Thanks
see
for
you
having
again
me,
soon.
guys. Talk to you soon.
Thanks,
All
Ben.
right,
Be
take care.
safe.
All right, so Carl, I guess we have a lot to talk about, Carl, but like it really was born of, I forget what format, texting or DMing by Twitter about the Bucks new uniforms. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Let's go.
Yeah, so one of my, contrary to what people might think, a lot of historians like sports, right? So we have like a sports texting group, and when the Bucks unveiled their new, City Edition uniform this year, a colleague of mine at Columbia, Frank Guritti, who writes, really good sports histories. He has a, fantastic book coming out later this year on how Texas changed sports, like for the nation. He wrote and he was just like, what type of Blue Lives Matter bullshit is this? And I was just like, huh. I didn't necessarily see it right away, but now I can't unsee it. Right. So then, Simon Balto, who is, you know, a colleague of mine, Big Ten history professor, who's actually a Bucks fan, you know, sends me the City Edition hoodie, and he's just like, I am gonna save so much money not buying Bucks gear this year because I cannot get beyond the fact that they put in this blue line, right? Like, you know, the City Edition jersey is actually, you know, almost all blue, which is weird. And it was just like, and the Bucks just don't even have a history of wearing blue, right? Like, and so like I understand that you can do whatever you want with City Edition jerseys. The Hawks did a fantastic tribute to King with theirs this year, you know, et cetera, right? You don't have to necessarily wear your colors. But given the role that the Bucks were playing, you know, in the bubble about leading protests against anti-police violence, et cetera, it just seemed, you know, we just can't, you know, chalk these things up to coincidence, right? That all of a sudden there seems to be sort of this thin blue line appearing in the Bucks uniforms of all uniforms, which kind of, you know, definitely led to some pause, if you will, amongst historians. And we were just chatting about it, like, you know, was this deliberate? Was it not? Does it matter, right? Like, does intention even matter here? Because now this can be read as it, you know, not to mention, think about how many thin blue line flags we saw at the Capitol insurrection in January 6th, right? Like, you know, so we know that the thin blue line has come to mean something beyond even just supporting law enforcement, right? Like, it's actually, you know, come to mean something, you know, even much more radical, right? Or much more, you know, radicalized. And so, you know, I just think it was an interesting kind of decision to include this, and whether or not somebody saw it or meant for it to come off that way, I'm not sure that matters. I think what matters is the finished product here. And, you know, I think folks are right to have some kind of pause for concern. And it might have gone over many of people's heads, right? Like many people actually.
It probably did.
Yeah.
Probably did, but still, Carl, how do you fix it?
I guess you stop wearing the City Edition.
How do they fix it?
Yeah, no, you know, I guess you acknowledge the mishap, right? You do what any kind of name brand does when they do something that they didn't see was either racially insensitive or politically insensitive in, you know, one direction or another. And you say, like, you know, for the rest of the year, we're just not gonna, you know, they change City Edition jerseys every year, right? So it's not like they're gonna lose a ton. Like, in the grand scheme of things, they're going to lose a lot of money, right? Because they produce these things in massive numbers. But in the grand scheme of things, they're not going to lose that much by, you know, tabling the City Edition jersey. If in fact, you know, there's enough cause for pause there, right? But then, you know, the flip side is, does then the Bucks thin blue line become some sort of like, you know, uniform for the other side, right? And then does it become a hot commodity and sells in ways that we don't, you know, don't want? Like, at this point, it might be a lose-lose, and I might have ruined all the true hoop audience who didn't see the thin blue line in that way and who just thought they were just trying to, you know, include like a little accent wall in their uniforms. But I feel like once you see it, you can't unsee it, and I felt that way about the Bucks, you know, City Edition jersey since the unveiling of it.
Tylenol pulled their whole product off the shelves because potentially there was some poison in them. I'm not sure they ever found any more. A few people got poisoned. I was a young then. What Randy just wrote is exactly right. Pull them off the shelves and send them to somewhere else where that blue line doesn't matter.
Right.
But it matters here.
It's so tricky though, because now it's going to be the left is trying to censor your free speech, and it's just a jersey, and we can't use blue anymore. Like, and then it's just a hornet's nest of messaging, right? Like, I don't know.
Well, but horizontal blue lines, just that right now, not something we should be wearing unless we really are kind of racist or very racist. It's not. And when you can wear blue.
When they announced it, when Carl first made me aware of it, it was like Wisconsin. Like, none of this was funding in Wisconsin, right? Like, in particular, right? Like, it was the nexus, and the Bucks were part of it, right? Like, this was one of the places America was fighting in the streets, right? It was really, really bad. And like, to add a blue line, I think for the first time in Bucks history at that time, I mean, I'm not a designer, but that seemed like a design choice that was like some kind of cute. I don't really get and to me, the thing is like, one thing I see business doing is kind of taking these kinds of controversies and treating them like they're little political dust-ups rather than like giant reckonings with things that have been real for hundreds of years, right? Like, very different thing. If it's like, oh, some people like the cops and some people don't, and well, it's tough and tricky. Like, that doesn't cut it, because that's where now we're saying everything that led to this isn't real. And actually, that's where I think you make an amazing point. Like, forget this one. Sports teams and uniformed police and military have been like in this PR love tangle for 100 years. Like, it's off the charts. You want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah, no, and and I think I'm sure a lot of your listeners and viewers are familiar with like Howard Bryant's work, and Howard Bryant, the journalist, has kind of been leading a leading voice on such a matter, right? About like propaganda, especially post 9/11, and and it's just been interesting to see, right? And I'll start by saying this, right? Like, so I am a college professor, right? And I'm a young college. I tell my students all the time, age is relative, right? Like, they're like, oh my God, you're such a young college professor. And I'm like, kind of, right? And it's like, because if I was in the NBA, I'd be the old guy with LeBron, right? But as a college professor, I'm the young guy, right? And so like age is all relative, right? But where I'm often reminded that I'm not so young is in the college classroom, right? And and what that means, wholeheartedly this year especially, is that if in fact you have a 1 to start your date of birth year, right? You're clear for drinking age, right? Like, anybody born in 2000 this year becomes an eligible drinker at 21 years old, right? And the reason I bring that up is not necessarily to talk about college kids drinking, but it's to actually bring up that if Howard Bryant's argument about post 9/11 sports and what it's actually meant about being married to the troops, right? We have an entire generation of kids who just haven't been separated from it at all, right? Who don't know what it means to see sports before 9/11, right? And so if in fact we want to unpack how these changes came about, then we have to kind of seriously fight, or seriously kind of at least sit with, what it's meant for sports teams to really think about the type of funding that they're receiving from the military on the one hand, but also what it means, with the heightened military state, of what that means for also the police, right? We've honored King this week, right? And Martin Luther King regularly reminded us that the 3 evils that are going to tear down this country are racism, poverty, and militarism, right? And we have to understand that militarism post 9/11 has been tied to the police in ways that we just didn't see prior to that. And what it's meant to even join the military and to serve and to honor the troops and to support the troops has drastically changed in the last 20 years. And some people can make the case that it changed for good, right? We haven't had to institute a draft in the past 20, however many years, because, recruitment numbers are so high, right? But even what it means to recruit into the military has changed its tone, right? Like, Henry, you and I were talking about like now people join the military to, become GI Joe of some way, shape, or form, right? Like, pro-gun folks, and, people want to go and shoot big things and blow things up. My dad, career Army guy who's getting ready to retire, his second career as an ROTC instructor, literally stopped encouraging his students who were coming out of ROTC programs of going straight into the military, because Delaware was one of the states that was really fighting back against kind of we would pay your college tuition, right? My dad joins the military in the 80s, in I think 81, 82, he joins the military, and he did it to get out of his situation, right? He did it so he could have some sort of potential funding for education, right? And it meant, Baldwin made a guest appearance back there, sorry. But and he did it, right, as a kind of avenue out, right? And the National Guard has, served that role for weekend warriors for years, right? Like, if you give us 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year, for 6 years, we will pay your education, you'll get the benefits of a veteran, et cetera, et cetera. Those ads don't run anymore, right? The ads that we see for recruitment, there's another one. The ads that we see for recruitment are come fight these everlasting wars that we don't know when they started, we don't know how they started, we damn sure don't know when they're going to end, right? And I think that's been tied to sports in the post 9/11 world in ways that we just haven't really sat with. And I think it's time for us to kind of really think about what it means to push back against that, right? And so the last point about thinking about somebody like Howard Bryant's work is and especially ties to the police here, because typically if I'm talking about the police, people don't think I'm talking about the military, right? And that's should be the way it is. But the problem is when the military when we hear support your heroes, right? Like the military and the police and for what it's worth, firefighters, et cetera, right, have kind of all been kind of combined under this hero label, especially in sports post 9/11, right? That like, if we're gonna have a heroes day, it's not only the military, but it's also the police, right? And when we're having these conversations about the militarization of the police force, about how the military is literally giving excess, equipment and to the police, and then when you see fundings of, or calls to defund the police, and we're talking about, yes, the LAPD who work inside of Los Angeles public schools shouldn't have grenade launchers. This is part of the defunding conversation. We're just like, well, where did they get those grenade launchers in the first place? And then you realize it's from the military, right? And so the military and the police have become tied in ways that we have to have serious conversations about. We know that people who do short bids in the military often become cops, right? We know that you can do your six-year bid and then come out and then start a career in law enforcement. And it's actually attractive for the police to recruit those types of people. But what does that mean, right? What does that mean when our military, who has a different set of, responsibilities becomes one and the same with the police, right? Because then when they start to police the communities in ways that we see occupied forces across this globe, the United States is in what, 70 something countries? The police don't need to look like that in cities across the country, but they do.
So you're from the military family with police in your family. You're a historian. Like, are
A lot of fights.
these like uniformed forces like I've seen arguments that they're kind of integrating forces, right? Like the army was like integrated with some mixed success somewhat early on, right? Or I've also seen, right, like that, I think there's an article in today's New York Times that basically the National Guard, for instance, is like a hotbed, or more convincingly, there was an article about this LA County Sheriff's Department report just came out with 50 years of deputies being somewhat openly known as supervisors, members of racist white gangs, etc. Right? So, like, do you see uniforms as inherently forces of racism? It's probably we don't have time, probably, right?
Yeah. No, that's a heavy one. I didn't know racism was going to be at the end of that question, right? Like
I didn't know either. I was kind of on an adventure.
What I will say is I think uniforms, and not just uniforms in this instance, right? Because I do think uniforms instill a sense of pride, right? And if we're going to study kind of the space that simply we're talking about just what you're wearing, it's supposed to mean something. It's supposed to be some sort of uplifting, right? That's going to be drastically different if you're wearing, say an NYPD uniform, or if you're wearing, the Universal Negro Improvement Association because you're a Garveyite, right? Like, like uniforms fit in different places, or if you're wearing the Milwaukee Bucks, thin blue line, right? Like, so uniforms can mean different things. I think, in this particular instance, if we're talking about uniform plus weapon, right, or weaponry, right, that then carries a different kind of weight, right? Like, the image of the soldier and the image of the warrior or the street cop, means something different. And I think, we need to be careful with what that has done over time in popular culture and movies and stuff like that. But also, what it's done for us to see just civilians carrying military grade weapons, right? I think a lot about just how desensitized we've become to civilians carrying assault rifles for whatever reason they think they need them, right? And I made the joke yesterday, Henry, that we were just like, even military grade steel becomes like a selling point, right? Like you want to buy a new Chevy, well, you know what this Chevy has? It has military grade steel. And it's just like, what the hell does that mean? Right? Like why do we need military grade steel on the car that I'm going to drive to Publix with? Right. And we've, as a culture and as a nation, we've become so desensitized to so much of this that, it doesn't matter if we see a man in a uniform or a woman in a uniform with a gun. We think, or depending on who the we is, we think different things of them, right? Like, and that doesn't matter if that person is walking out of a precinct, is walking out of a barracks, or is, standing pat behind a NBA coach because they're doing security detail in an NBA arena, right? Like, we've become so desensitized to what it means that if you have a uniform on with said gun, then you're, for whatever reason, okay carrying the gun. And we just know that that's not necessarily the case.
This is new. You guys are young, but when Stripes came out, the military was a joke. We all understood the joke, right? Private Benjamin with Goldie Hawn as a soldier, like that. Colin Powell wrote about this in his first book. Like, that's how the military was seen because of what happened in Vietnam. So This is all a very new thing that's happened where, as you described, it's almost like I never thought about military grade steel, but it's a perfect analogy for what you're talking about. All of a sudden, it's like state of the art.
Right. Well, and I think, like, there was something with Alex Smith recently, right, about getting his surgery done, with like Pentagon like doctors, right, who like built his leg, and now he's back in the NFL, yeah. And it's just like, bravo, right? But it means something about what does it mean that we think of technology and technological advancements as being tied to the military, right? Regardless of where they are. And to your point about strikes, Coach, I also think, what we need to realize is that we've moved past the day where it's okay to critique the military. And there was a moment where everybody was critiquing the military, right? Not just the left, right? Yes. But, the draft meant so much to so many different families that they were thinking of ways, of getting out of the draft, right? Of not going into the military. And because there weren't nearly as many avenues to not go into the military, people were really upset with the role that the military played in this country, right? And so there was opposition from both sides against the military. But we've reached a day, where if in fact you're thinking about critiquing the military, good luck to your career, right? It's just something that you can't do. And I think, again, to not beat the Howard Bryant horse, I think one of the things that he pulls out about Kaepernick is that even Kaepernick in his protests and thinking about kind of taking a knee against, to bring attention or raise awareness around police violence, one of the first things he did was sit and talk with a Green Beret to be like, how can I be sure that I'm not critiquing the military? Right? Like, that was built into his critique of the police, right? Of that there's kind of like distance from critiquing the military because, it's hogwash if you critique the military. And, it wasn't always the case, right? This is actually very new, contrary to what we might think.
Hi, Gerard.
Hello, Henry.
He's just steaming over there. Come on, Gerard, bring it.
I have nothing new or exciting to add. I love when Carl is on because he really gives us all this fresh perspective, although it's history, so I guess it's not fresh, but it's fresh for those.
The oldest perspective. Yeah.
We're happy you like sports, Carl. Otherwise, you wouldn't be on with
seriously.
us.
It is fresh for us who don't delve deep into all the history text, right? But I do think your point about Howard Bryant and the work that he's done is really important here. And I put the book, The Heritage, in the chat so people don't know it. And that clearly outlines how, sports has co-opted the military and been as loud a mouthpiece for championing all the values of an institution that at best is suspect, right? Like, and at worst is way worse than that. Yeah. So yeah, I encourage everybody to read it and sort of realize how these things sort of happen to us and how we just accept them as, oh, this must be just what it is because it's just placed in front of us, right? Like it's really interesting.
Just quick shout out, anybody who wants to watch Joe Biden's speech, I'm informed is starting now. So if you want to run and watch that, I won't think less of you. It's okay.
People are crying.
In the show.
I have a lot of girls I grew up with. They're texting me. They're all crying like crazy right now.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy.
Crying is welcome. It's yeah.
I did want to talk about the vaccine really quick though.
Yeah.
Because the thing about the NBA, and I say this all the time, and Adam knows it, and this is why like he's so conscious of it. Like, look, this is the Black League. Like the NBA is the Black League more than any other sport. It just is, and it's the way in which we have the intimacy with them because they don't wear helmets and their faces are in front of us all the time, and they're among the most popular people in the world. So Adam is always mindful of that because we live in a world or in an environment where the people we talk to generally like the NBA, right? So it's generally fine. But talk to people who don't watch NBA and you'll get some really interesting opinions on what they think about this league and the players that are in it. So, this idea that they could jump the line, people would 1000% think that and go nuts, literally.
1000% is a big percentage.
Yeah, I know. It's the most.
Carl, you were saying to me that like, recruiting changed and it used to be about like, we'll pay for your college. And now it's about like, oh, we are kicking ass and you can shoot somebody or whatever. That's not exactly how you said it. You said it in a more professorial way. But it struck me that this was, this is in movies now too, right? And this is where sports fits in is like, I feel like, especially the NFL, but also the NBA is like, this idea of individual muscular invincibility, right? Which I would point out, actually, at one point I ended up at some conference with like the world's most cutting edge people on like physical training, right? And what works in looking like that, right? And they were talking about some place, Fort something or other, somewhere in California, where they do a lot of cutting edge research on like how to train soldiers and stuff. And it struck me, I'm like, oh, like I guess like doping's not banned there, right?
Right.
And the guy who had done some consulting there was like, oh, they have all the best stuff. And suddenly I was like, oh, ding, 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 ding. Like this, I feel like we're seeing now in sports, in the military, in even the sort of nature and character and style and approach of the weirdos who stormed the Capitol, like this idea of like we are all Rambo, right? This sort of like just muscularness that's like maybe a little bit steroid era, a little testosterone that's supplemented, right? It's not the same as like, well, gosh darn it, you're going to want a college education, right? It feels a lot like someone's going to be alpha and it better be you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's, the hyper masculinization of our country, right?
Yeah.
Like, to be a manly man is to look a certain way, is to act a certain way, is to behave in certain ways, right? Which is always funny because it's like, not only do you have to be big, but you also have to carry the biggest guns, right? Like, it's just like, then what did I get big for? Like, what did I waste all of this energy and effort to grow in human size, right? If I'm just going to be exaggerated by my gun size, right? No, but I do think it's I do think it's it's unfortunate, right? Because again, as the son of a soldier and as somebody who genuinely appreciates what the military has meant for like my family, what the military has meant for countless like really Black families right across this country. It's just that like even they come out and in a way that is just like, it's like, damn, like, we've been, as Black people, we've been fighting in wars since the first, right? Since the Revolutionary War, right? Like there's track records of Black people in every war in this country as serving their country. While their experiences have changed, right? Their commitment to this nation has not, right? And it's always kind of been there. But, there are just moments in which they can't brag and they can't boast and they can't, like they have to, put person before, before country, right? And and in some ways that's a really effed up space to be in, right? Like my dad was so excited about today and thinking about the inauguration because he's like, it's the first time in 4 years as a military guy I get to put my flag back out in front of my house, right? Because even the United States flag has meant something these past 4 years to a career military man, right? Who is just like, I get to put the flag back out, right? Like I get to, and it's just like, and he had, my family has ties to the Bidens, they're Delaware people and, and it's just like, and so like, he was just so ecstatic about today in a way that it was just like, this is what it was like, for even though it was just 4 years ago, it feels like, 20 easily, right? Like my entire adulthood, right? Like I was just like, this former president has been president for all of my adulthood, it feels like. And it was just 4 years.
You were single back when this started.
That's right. I was not engaged when he was in office. And but no, it's but I do think, it's important for us to kind of think about just where we are getting these messages, right? Or where these messages are coming through. And unfortunately, it comes through in sports in ways that, we can ignore. We can look right past if we're not kind of paying attention, right? Like we've normalized flyovers. We've normalized, military discounts and, hero nights at the games. We've normalized, right? And truth of the matter is that stuff hasn't always been there, right? Contrary to what it might seem like. It's become so normal that it feels like it's always been part of the game. And it just hasn't, and, the unfortunate thing is the people that are sitting in the stands at these games are also the same people who are telling, LeBron James to shut up and dribble, right? So what does it mean when when those signals and those messages are being sent to those people who are then, they can't go play on the court, right? Like, so they're going to explore one of these other avenues, which can potentially be, becoming a police officer, becoming a soldier, and it's just like, what do we do with that?
Ooh, all right, we are out of time. Carl, thank you so much. We could have 30 shows on these things you just said there. Gerard, Judy, David, of course. Thank you, everybody. Have a good inauguration day. We'll see you on Friday.